Climate Collab Challenge. The contest was improving firewood for clean cook stoves. And this excited me particularly because a lot of times in the clean cook stoves world, people are focused solely on the stove and not thinking so much about the fuel. So in my own research, we've done a lot of testing in the lab where everything is nicely controlled, things are well ventilated. But in reality, that's not always the case, right? So you may be in a kitchen with poor ventilation, and people are often harvesting wood that's wet or green. And we know that wet wood causes the efficiency to drop significantly and the emissions to increase as well. So we have two winners here that we're going to introduce who have designed solutions to help address the wet firewood issue. I'll talk a little bit about the challenge and where this contest came from. So it was a collaboration between a Colombian NGO called Fondo de, sorry about this, Fondo de Patrimonio Natural, and the online platform Minca Dev. And their goal was to work with communities in the Caribbean region of Colombia to co-create solutions to address issues around deforestation in a national park that had recently been developed. And these indigenous communities in this national park were under increasing pressure from high rates of tourism, more people coming to visit the park, and the requirements that are needed to meet those tourist needs to keep them fed and housed. So the NGO discovered that up to about 500 kilograms of wood per day were being consumed recently to prepare meals for these tourists, and they wanted to design a solution with the community to help address that issue and try to reduce those fuel consumption behaviors. So they designed a stove, but then quickly found that the stove was one part of the solution, but the wet fuel being used hindered the performance of that stove. So that's how this contest came to be. There were about 10 proposals, I think, that were submitted, all very good proposals. And we have two of the top proposals represented here. So I'm going to briefly let those winners introduce themselves, and then we'll actually watch their videos that they submitted with the proposal, followed by a Q&A. So we'll have a chance to ask questions to the winners. And then we'll end with everyone breaking out into groups around each of the projects to create a supportive environment for those teams. So there are challenges, there are barriers, there are opportunities that each of these groups faces moving forward with their project. We really want to try to support them as they move forward. So we have James Grayson and Aditya Sujit. And I'll let Aditya start out with an introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Aditya from Bangalore, India. I'm come all the way from India to present my project here. My solution proposes for modifying a gas cylinder into a cooking stove. And it can also solve multiple problems. I'll let the video do the talking.
Great. Thank you, Aditya. And James, if you can hear us, can you give us a quick introduction to yourself and your project?
Yes, certainly. So I'm James Grayson. I run a blind spot think tank in England, which is mostly policy, but we also like to do some practical work. Most of that involves designing cook stoves that are then used to make biochar, which goes into compost and into demonstration vegetable beds, where we grow masses of vegetables that feed the people here and also store carbon. One of the things we found, of course, whenever you're making biochar is that you need incredibly dry wood, or you need drier wood than you would normally have, for example, in your fire or your wood stove at home. You need typically 14% moisture or less, and so this is one of our solutions that we developed for drying the wood before it can go into the cook stoves so you can make the biochar.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much, James. So now what we're going to do is actually see the 3-minute videos that both Aditya and James prepared along with their proposals so we get a better sense of what those entail. So can we run the videos, please?
The drying chimney, which is the Judge's Choice winner in 2016 MIT Climate Collab competition of drying firewood for treating cook stoves. Once you've got the dry firewood, what you can do is use the cook stove that creates biochar or charcoal, which is a store of carbon. You can use the dry firewood from the drying chimney for all kinds of cook stoves, but I like to use it for a biochar cook stove. This is the chimney of the cook stove. So all that we're doing is replacing the ordinary chimney, which is just made from tin cans, with this huge thing, the drying chimney. There's a metal pipe in the middle, so the heat goes up the metal pipe and then down through the wood in the center, and then out through the vents. The wood in here now is about 21% moisture. The wood in here is between about 15 and 20% on average. And we're going to see if we can make it dry with the drying chimney. So let's start off with a little bit straight. Better something good than cook stove's been burning for about 5 minutes now. It's heated up the firewood inside the drying chimney, and you can see some of the steam coming out from the vents at the bottom of the drying chimney. A decent wood test before now says 0% moisture. I'll look at some pieces of wood from the bottom of the drying chimney. 10%. 0%. 8% moisture. I hope people will find the drying chimney design useful. It's a way to get the firewood dry enough that you can use it in cook stoves without making smoke. You can also get the firewood below 15% moisture and use it in biochar making cook stoves. So that in future, instead of just cutting the trees down more slowly, you can be replanting trees. Looking forward to talking with the Columbia Natural Heritage Fund to see if this is useful for their communities. I'm interested to talk to anyone else around the world who would like to use this design and like to work with me in trying it in their areas. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Tim. Okay, thanks so much, James. That was a great video. Aditya will now queue up your video.
Hello, I'm Aditya from India. I'm a senior innovator and with an Samberg track record in problem solving. I run 20 innovation challenges. I'm a mechanical engineer with a diverse research. And companies and countries around the globe solve some of the most pressing and challenging problems for a living. I'm also the founder of newchallenge.com, which is an innovation portal dedicated for making innovation opportunities available to all. I also inspire people to crowdsource to solve problems. Thanks for making smokeless gas cylinders with good dryer, kindness, and public trust. I did a process for modifying old unused gas cylinders into a smokeless char for cooking. The heat really required easily is used for drying wood. My solution addresses multiple problems and is important because it provides a cheap, smokeless char for the poor, which they can use indoors to cook food without heaters and shocking. It is important because it can dry moist firewood, making it easier to dry wood even during rains. It is important because it reduces old, unused gas cylinders, which otherwise can be scrapped as metal. Metal to recycle resources in waste of energy and emissions, making bad for climate change. The estimated cost of 40.5 kilogram of gas that I'm proposing is $100. 60% of the cost is for acquired unused gas cylinder, meaning if we can somehow find used abandoned unused gas cylinder, then we can reduce the cost by $60. And if it is mass manufactured, the cost can be further lowered. The only cost will be the cost of cutting and some hardware accessories. as of now. I have a solid idea, I have a product and market research, and I have tested out the practical stability in the real world on a real gas data. I'm looking for production kinds and expertise that can help me to connect with the right people. Here, right people means people with unused abandoned gas cylinders or gas cylinder manufacturers, which can help me in taking this project forward. The deadline that I'm aiming is within 1 year. Can you over?
Okay, let's thank Aditya. All right, well done. Now we're going to transition into the question and answer portion of the session. I have a couple questions queued up, and then we'll take questions from the audience as well. So we'll start with Aditya, and also you, James, next. What's the most important takeaway that you want people to get from your proposal, your project? Mm-hmm.
My proposal addresses multiple problems. It's not only about climate change. There are other problems also that is being addressed here. So talking about the problems, it reduces the emissions. How it does is recycling steel is quite expensive process. To recycle one ton of steel takes around 308 kilogram of coal, which is an expensive process. So it cut down the cost if you can reuse it to make something better instead of recycling the steel. So gas cylinder is something which we can't reuse it, because even if there is a micro pore within the gas cylinder, then it is unfit because we can't take risk with safety. So there is no way we can reuse it by patching it up. So it has to be recycled. So other option is to reuse it for something better, something like that I'm proposing. So the other issues is smoke from while cooking is a serious issue. Every day, women around the world have to, while cooking, they encounter the smoke within confined homes. So this is a serious concern, which will lead to lung diseases and other serious concerns within the house. And it brings tears every day to them. So, and people are choked to death. So this is a smokeless cylinder. So we can, the exhaust system can be connected to the exhaust chimney of the house. And it is also portable. At present, what people are doing is they are just taking 2 bricks, putting some twigs and wood between it and lighting it in fire. And that's how they're cooking. And that too inside the house, which is very dangerous. And it could also lead to fire mishap. So this is in a confined space. So there is, it solves most of the risk associated with it. And the other issue is cooking is a trouble during winter and during rain. So since it is confined and it offers a good opportunity for cooking inside without wind or rain. The other concern is, which is the goal of this challenge, is drying firewood. So from my video, you can see that I'm placing firewood surrounding the smokeless gas cylinder stove. How it works is there are 2 modes of heat propagation, that is via convection and via radiation. So the heat that is generated is transferred by convection and radiation, and this is used for evaporation. And it may not be enough for the evaporation. So how it works is it heats up the surrounding air. So the humidity from the surrounding air is reduced. So as humidity from the surrounding air is reduced, the rate of evaporation is higher. So that means you can dry more firewood.
Good.
And talking about other concerns, if you're in a developed nation and you think you're wondering what to do with this project, I say you can just take it in your backyard and do some barbecue cooking.
Good. Okay, thank you, Aditya. Turning it over to you now, James. What are some of the key takeaways that you want us to gather from your proposal?
I guess the overall message is that it's a way of exploring how ambitious we can be with solving climate problems. So, for example, rather than trying to start with the policy discussions that a lot of people find, or almost inevitably get stuck straight away, we can start with something that's very practical and tangible for people that you can actually get your hands on, something you can do at home. And the particular advantage of the dry firewood is that you can not only use any old cook stove, you can use a particular cook stove which can make biochar. So it's a way of storing carbon, which is a way of regenerating topsoils, growing food in places where you couldn't grow it otherwise, potentially regrowing forests that wouldn't survive otherwise, and exploring the whole idea of not just reducing emissions, but actually finding ways to practically take carbon out of the atmosphere and keep it stored away somewhere useful, like in the soil or in increased forest growth. And then after that, after you get a sense that this is possible because you can really do it for yourself at home, then you can enter policy discussion and actually, I think, potentially make much more progress than we could previously.
Great. Yeah, thank you, James. Can you tell us a little bit, Aditya, about some of the major challenges or barriers? What are some of the specific things that your project is facing now that you're seeking help on, maybe from people in this room?
Okay. Initially, it was challenging to convince people to think different, because gas cylinder is something that you don't bring a matchstick near it. So people will be thinking, right, what is this guy doing? Just letting it on a fire, a gas cylinder? Seriously? That's what. So even in the comment session initially, so people were asking it. So I was able to convince most of them that it's just thinking different.
Good, thank you. And for you, James, major challenges or barriers on the project as of now?
I guess the next step with this project, with dry firewood, would be to kind of open source the design, to write it up in more detail. If somebody wanted to make it for themselves, for example, what kind of kitchen bin would they like to use, and how do you join together the aerosol cans to go in the middle to make the tube? That kind of practical detail, and to get that up online or in a mobile app so that people anywhere in the world can see it and use it for free. This is work that we're currently doing together with a US NGO called 2050 Kids for the biochar cook stoves. And so, if we can find interest in the drying chimney, this is something I'd like to see done for the drying the firewood stage as well. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. I'd like to open it up now. Does anyone else have questions for our presenters here? Yeah. Do you want folks to use the mic?
You won't hear if you don't use it.
Okay, so maybe I'll hand this around. There you go.
Aditya, I couldn't see how your equipment was smokeless. It looked as if it had a chimney coming out the side. I'm afraid in your video, the picture was up only for a couple of seconds. Could you explain that?
Yeah. So how this thing works is the gas cylinder is cut on the side and a hinge door is placed. So that is the area where you will load the wood. So there is another port on the other side from where the smoke which is coming out is taken out through an exhaust port. So there is a pipe there.
Oh, you have a pipe.
Correct.
To it.
Yeah.
It goes outside.
Yeah. And this pipe is always extendable to the chimney of the house. So whatever smoke is coming out, you can directly take it out of the house.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
I have two questions. One is, it appears both systems burn something as a heat source, and I wondered if you had quantified, how much power is required to, dry out some metric of wood. And then the second question was, many people in a traditional environment are used to doing things in a particular way. How do you convince them, to adopt new technologies like these?
So answering your first question, the thing is that the longer you operate the firewood, the better the wood surrounding it will dry. That's the key. And taking up your next question is adaptation into different communities. So since this is a portable gas cylinder, it's like a gas cylinder, you can carry it and place it wherever you want. So it is something you can fit in your kitchen, or it is something that you can place anywhere. So it is easier in terms of adaptability. It is not a bulk device. So I think that makes it more adaptable.
Okay. Just to kind of follow up on that, do you see a big behavior change that's required with this along the lines of adoption?
No, I
Is
don't
there
see.
something
Like
that will
I already told, like normally people are putting two brakes and putting a firewood in between and lighting a match. So it's much better. So I think people will, what do you call it, appreciate it because it solves most of the problems that is associated with the former.
Okay, good.
So it will be a better option, I guess.
And over to you, James. Any considerations of energy input and then also the adoption issue surrounding the technology?
First, the energy input. I thought it may be interesting for people to actually see the wood. This is about 250 grams of firewood that's previously been dried. So this is about the quantity that I would use for running the drying chimney, for running the cook stove that then provides the heat for the drying chimney. And using that much wood, you can burn the cook stove for about 20 to 25 minutes. And that should be enough to dry about 8 kilos of firewood from about 20% down to under 10% moisture. If you're using wood chips, let's see if you can see the wood chips. This is a scoop of wood chips. And you want about 2 scoops, which is roughly a liter or just under a liter of wood chips to run the thing, to do one batch of firewood. I'm sorry, I missed the second question. What else should I say?
There was a question regarding adoption of the technology. Do you foresee challenges or maybe major behavior changes associated with this?
I think it's probably the kind of thing that might be best done as a self-organizing endeavor. You know, when people around the world, wherever they are, find that they've got some firewood, they need it to be drier. You know, maybe they're just running a project of cook stoves for tourists, or maybe they want to make biochar. So they'll find they've got a need. They'll go online or on their mobile phone, and then hopefully in future they'll find the information to build one of these for themselves. And I guess at least in the short term, there's there's these stainless steel kitchen bins that are found all over the world that tend to be terribly badly made, but they also, on the other hand, once after they're thrown away, they make fantastic drying chimney cylinders. So you can convert this kind of rubbish into something that's very useful, which I guess is another form of adaptation.
Great. Other questions from the audience? Yeah.
I'm curious what sort of input either of you have had from any communities that do rely on this type of wood burning activity.
You mean what input I am seeking from the community right now?
Or if you've had any yet.
As of now, I had discussed my ideas with a lot of people back in India, and they are taking their input in incorporating into my proposal. So, and going forward, I totally agree with James in making the proposal vertical, the idea of open source, so that anyone around the world can just use it. It's just not like I am the only one who can use it. I'm just leaving it as an open source with most of my other ideas also, which is open source. So I'm looking for leads to people who could, who has surplus gas cylinders and who will be interested in collaborating with me in taking this idea forward.
James, did you hear that question?
Yes, thank you. We're still at the beginning of the project for crowdsourcing or open sourcing the biochar cook stove designs, and it hasn't been done with the drying chimneys yet. But I'm hoping and looking forward to working together with the Columbia Natural Heritage Fund on applying the drying chimney design for their situation. The pilot work that we've done already with the biochar cook stove shows that it's actually very easy to take up in a range of different communities, both in developing and developed countries, and that people are interested in a cook stove design that they don't have to buy, they don't have to pay for. They can make it themselves, and they can use materials that are available locally, which is basically used tin cans. I think it's nice for the cook stoves are basically smoke free. That they should, when they're working properly with dry fuel or dry wood, under 15%, there should be no visible smoke. But still, you can use them outside. If you have a chimney set up, you could use them indoors, as Aditya was saying as well. So far in early stages, we've had a positive response, but we're looking forward to working with more communities around the world on the cook stoves and on the drying chimney. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question back here.
Is there any heat regulator system or button if you need a steam flame
it's
in the
there.
cooking process? What is?
No, it is there. How it works is the open part of the gas cylinder, it's cut out. So it can, when you regulate it, it can enlarge and decrease. So based on that, you can control. And also there is other thing in the gas cylinder. It can, there's an intake fan which can regulate the air that is supplied. That is an additional attachment. It is good to have. So it can regulate the amount of air that is entering inside the burning chamber. So based on that, you can regulate. So when there is no air that is entering inside, then it will ultimately die off.
Does that answer your question? Yeah. And then can we get a response from James on that too, in terms of temperature regulation?
Yes, certainly. For the drying chimney, you don't really need temperature regulation. You just want a steady kind of 6-inch flame running for the whole period, 20 to 30 minutes. But the other design that I work with, the biochar cook stoves, you can have quite a simple, basic heat regulation or flame regulation with that, just by having a little piece of metal that covers over some of the primary air, which is the air going into the charcoal making process at the base of the cook stove. So you can have temperature or flame regulation with the cook stove as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jim. Other questions from the audience? Yep, thanks.
I was wondering if you could reach out to companies, Aditya, like Rhino. They make propane tanks, and I'm sure that they might be able to provide you with ones that can't be used recycled, because that's usually how propane tanks are given back to a store in America. They are and to be refilled and reused, so that they could possibly help.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Do you have a response to that, Aditya?
Yeah.
It's a good suggestion.
And that is what I'm looking for.
Good.
Yeah.
Great.
I actually managed to talk with most of the people here during the other sessions. And there were people who were giving suggestions also, like to incorporate biogas into it, to keep a hole inside in the bottom of the gas cylinder. You can incorporate biogas into, if you can bring a supply of biogas, and you can incorporate it into this gas cylinder stove.
Good. Other questions before we wrap up and move into breakout sessions to help Aditya and James? Okay, I think we'll go ahead and do that. So I think the idea is we have 2 spaces on either side of the room, one for each of their projects. And it looks like is James' project over here, and Aditya's is on this side. So I think for folks who want to stick around and give a little bit more tailored support or learn a little bit more in detail about their projects, you can move over to those areas. I think we can just bring chairs over to them. And then we'll have James on a computer on this side. Is that right? Yeah. Great.
James?
Hello.
Are you hearing us?
Yes, I can hear you. Is that Julian?
Perfect, yeah. Okay. That's great. So, I think we can start. Yeah, but maybe you can sit here. So no, you are participating? Okay, perfect. So it's just, okay, so.
Okay, just a quick question, which is, what sort of tools are required to manufacture your dryer?
I think I used, I think as far from memory, I didn't use any power tools. I used basically the same tools I used for making the biochar cook stoves, which are mostly sort of ordinary things like a pair of pliers, a screwdriver, a few bolts. The only tool that's a bit unusual is this guy here, which is an aviation type tin snips. And they cost about, over here, they cost about between £3 and £10, depending on whether you get a cheap pair or a fancy pair. So this was a fancy pair that cost about £10. And it's a right curving one. These aviation tin snips you can get right or left curving, and I get a right one because I'm a left curving one because I'm right-handed. So it's easier to make the left type curves when you're cutting the metal. So if you didn't have one of those, you could use a power tool for the cutting as well. That would also be fine if people have power tools instead.
What are the fasteners used? Is it screws or just bent metal, or how do you tie it all together?
At the moment, it's just bent metal. So the main connection that you would need to make is between the metal tube that goes up through the center and the metal base. So you need a little hole in the metal base. And I think all I did was bend some little flaps down when I cut the hole for the metal base, all the way around the hole, and then the metal tube that goes up through the middle. That at the moment it's just squished in, just stuck in there because it's tight. But you could put a wire ring around there and tighten it, or if you got keen, you could put rivets in or bolts. But at the moment, it's just sitting there. And that actually has the advantage that you can move it up or down to adjust the height of the metal tube, and that controls how much space there is at the top where the hot air is coming out, and before it goes down around the sides and through the wood.
So James, have you got a picture of this on a website that we could see?
Yes, of course. It's on the Climate Collab proposals website. If you go to the competition, to the dry firewood competition, you'll find the one of the two top entries there should be the one that we're talking about, and there are pictures of it, photographic pictures, and there's also a little design picture which should probably have enough information if you wanted to try making one for yourself.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome, and you're also welcome to yell out if there's a question and it's something which is unclear with it.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit more about biochar as a fuel? I'm not familiar with that, and how is it made, and why is it better than firewood, and things like that?
Well, that's the funny thing, is that biochar is actually just another word for charcoal. And what it means is that with the charcoal, you're doing something unusual. Instead of burning it like people usually do with charcoal, you're doing anything but burning it, which is why you get a different name. So it's charcoal that's called biochar because you're not burning it. And that means it's not actually a fuel for the cook stoves. It's a byproduct. It's something that's left over after you've done the cooking, after you've done the burning with the cook stove. Let me see if I can show you some here. This is some of the biochar. Is that visible at your end?
Yeah.
And that's actually the amount of biochar that's left over after using the cook stove once. So that's for about 20 or 25 minutes of cooking. It would be, I think, about 80 to 100 grams of charcoal. So here's a couple of pieces up close. And of course, you could use that for burning. You could use it in a cook stove or a barbecue to burn and do some cooking with. But actually, what's interesting to do with it is to keep it as a store of carbon. And there's quite a wide variety of things you can do with it as a store of carbon. But the kind of basic, most standard and most interesting use to start with would be to put it into compost. And that helps the compost to work. The compost will burn fast, will cook down faster, and it'll be more aerobic. You'll get a better quality of compost. But also, after the compost is finished, you've got the biochar mixed in with it. So it becomes a way of adding the nutrients of the compost and the biochar to your soil at the same time. So your soil becomes a carbon store, both with the compost and with the biochar. And the biochar is non-biodegradable. So it ends up staying in the soil for hundreds or thousands of years.
Wow.
And then, as well as the benefit of the compost being in your soil, you get the added benefits from the biochar, because the biochar is helping the soil structurally. So you get more air in there. It'll absorb water and drain water better than it did before. But it also works biochemically better than it did previously. So the biochar works in particular as a store of nutrients. It'll hang on to nutrients that it finds from the compost or from, even if you're using synthetic fertilizers, they'll tend to be stored in that massive fine pore structure of the charcoal. But then when the plant roots are needing the nutrients, the biochar will release them. So you get a symbiotic relationship between the plant roots and the biochar. And you also tend to get an increase in yet another form of carbon store, which is mycorrhizal fungi. And the mycorrhizal fungi will be living with the biochar, sometimes in the biochar, but also in the soil. And they'll act as a transport mechanism between the biochar and the plant roots. So that's the biochar.
So,
do you have to pound the biochar down so it's in smaller pieces before you add it to the compost?
Well, you can do, yes. I tend to quite often for the cook stove use chunks of wood which have been run through a wood chipper or a wood shredder. So this is what the fuel looks like. Let's see if you can see that. And what that means is that you end up with pieces of biochar which are typically quite small. So here's some of the biochar which is made from the wood chunk or wood chips. And that's fine, actually, that size, sort of 2 centimeters and less. It's fine to use that size as it is without breaking it down any further. But what you could do if you had larger pieces of biochar, because you're using larger pieces of firewood, you could crush them a bit by walking on them. And probably what I would do then is I would sieve it through a kind of an inch type size mesh. And then the larger pieces I would use either for putting in the bottom of large pots or for the drainage in raised beds where you want to provide some kind of water store, or in water purification systems, and then use the small pieces to go into compost and into the soil.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
say I've got a Russian fireplace. I don't know whether you've heard about those.
A Russian fireplace. That means it's from Russia. It doesn't mean it's in a hurry.
No. As a matter of fact, it does mean it's in a hurry, because it's instead of normal wood burning stoves like we have in New England, it burns in a short while. So the fire that heats the Russian fireplace for either 12 or 24 hours heats all the bricks of the Russian fireplace. It only burns in 2 hours. So you give it as much air as you want. And I end up with ash, not biochar.
Yes.
And so I suppose the biochar comes with an absence of oxygen. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, it is possible to make biochar in a normal wood stove, because quite often when in particular if you've got a glass front and you can see it working, you'll see the fuel wood in there at a certain stage will look like charcoal. So it won't look like wood anymore. And if you take it out and put it into a saucepan with a lid, or into like a biscuit tin with a lid, and you exclude the oxygen, then when it cools down, you'll have usable biochar. It's also possible to put wood into a tin in your wood stove, and then just heat it up using the normal fire in other parts of the wood stove, and then you'll end up with something again like biochar. But the usual way to make biochar is in some kind of cook stove or a kiln that's adapted to do what you said, which is to exclude the oxygen during the process of burning. You can do that with what's called a retort, which is to hold the fuel wood in a container and light another fire underneath it, which creates the heat that heats up the fuel wood to above 200 degrees, and then it creates wood gases, and you're left with just the charcoal afterwards. But the more efficient way of doing it is to use a kind of cook stove, which doesn't require the sacrifice of any kind of fuel wood to burn off, to create the heat to burn off the wood gas, because you're actually making wood gas from the entire furnace full. The whole stock of wood is converted into charcoal, and you just because of the way the cook stove is designed, you're excluding most of the primary air, or most of the air from the burning process. And that's the type of cook stove which I use as the fuel source for the drying chimney. So here's one of the cook stoves that I use. That's the outside of the cook stove. But there are other designs for biochar cook stoves as well. The one that I use is just chosen because it's particularly simple to design, and you can use tin cans to make it from, which is easier than fabricating it from sheet metal, or trying to weld or rivet stainless steel.
So what's bad in the smoke from wet wood? I mean, is it unburnt, basically hydrocarbons that are emitted at that point that don't once the wood is dry?
You're asking about the steam, the smoke, or the steam that you could see coming off in the video from the drying chimney. Is that right?
Well, actually, I'm asking, I mean, if people cook over with wet wood, right? I mean, I've had the experience of campfire, and it's annoying to get it in your face, but what's bad about it specifically? In other words, what chemicals get released, and what are the hazards of wet wood versus dry wood?
Yes, I guess the first thing about wet wood is that it's just quite inefficient. So the largest proportion of the smoke that you see coming off the wet wood fire, whether it's a campfire or whether it's a cook stove, is going to be steam. And the steam will have little particles of ash and unburnt hydrocarbons, as you say, and also unburnt wood gases, which is carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide and hydrogen. But the first thing, I guess, is just that it's very inefficient. So you've got, whenever you can see steam coming off in the smoke, it means that your fire is having to use up a lot of its heat just boiling off the water that's in the wood. And so that whether you're dealing with an open fire or a cook stove, you would generally want to not be seeing any visible steam. You want the wood to be going into your burn dry enough that you're not having to waste much of the energy in evaporating or boiling off the water that's in your fuel. So if you've got a good functioning cook stove or a good functioning a wood stove or open fire, there shouldn't really be any visible steam coming off from smoke. So that means that if you're still seeing smoke, that's because there's an inefficiency in the burning process, which is going to be some unburnt hydrocarbons. It's going to be wood gases which are created through the fuel wood being heated up, but not enough, either not enough air or not enough heat applied to the burning wood gas to make sure that the wood gas is properly burnt off. And that means that if you've got dry wood, for example, going into a cook stove, and you can see some smoke coming off, then that means that the wood gas is not really being burnt efficiently. And that would then be a design problem in the cook stove, or you could say it's a design problem in the wood stove if it's a stove that you're using inside your house. And that's typically solved by improving or increasing the flow of preheated secondary air. You know, quite often in a wood stove that you have in your house, you'll see a little flap for adjusting the airflow near the top of the wood stove. And that's intended just to improve the efficiency of the burn, so that the wood gas that's created by the normal process of burning doesn't go up the chimney, but it gets burned within the wood stove. And if that's happening effectively, you shouldn't see any visible smoke coming off if you're putting dry firewood in.
We just have a few.
Okay, one last question. That is, what are the gases that come out of your flue? Out of a charcoal burner, have you measured what gases are actually coming out at all?
So from what you call the charcoal burner is actually a charcoal maker. So the intention of the design and the process of using it is to generate charcoal, but you were asking about the exhaust gases that come out when you're doing that. And so long as you're putting some reasonably dry firewood or fuel wood in, which is, in the case of a biochar cook stove, that means under 15% moisture levels, 14% or less, then there should be no visible smoke. That means that the amount of steam in there is going to be very small. There might still be some steam in there, but it's such a low proportion that actually you can't see it. And there also, you shouldn't be getting unburnt hydrocarbons or unburnt wood gases, because in a decent biochar cook stove, you should always have a decent flow, a sufficient flow of preheated secondary air, which is a flow of air that's designed to come in next to the cook stove and next to the area where the burn is happening, so it gets heated up. And then it gets mixed with the wood gases, and the wood gases and the preheated secondary airflows, they mix together and they burn together. So actually the wood gas actually improves in its flammability. It becomes better to burn after it's mixed with the secondary air. And then when it's coming out, you should more or less only be getting carbon dioxide. You shouldn't really be getting anything which is unpleasant to breathe or dangerous. And I've tested that with a sort of domestic carbon monoxide alarm, which you can get the alarms which actually show you the measurements of the parts per million in carbon monoxide. And generally, when the cook stove is running and there's no visible smoke as it should be, there's pretty close to no detectable carbon monoxide. So the short answer to your question is that the exhaust is more or less just carbon dioxide. And in terms of the proportions, about half the carbon that was in the fuel is ending up being lost as carbon dioxide. So that has to be reabsorbed in new plant growth, which means that there's, give you a good reason to be planting crops to grow food or planting trees to make the next lot of fuel. But also half of the carbon that was originally in your fuel is retained as a stored carbon in the biochar. So that's the carbon that actually becomes the carbon positive part, or negative emissions part, that goes into your compost and into your soil.
Thank you. Learned an awful lot.
Have you ever measured what the net of the drying and then consuming the dried wood is in terms of useful heat versus burning the wet wood? I mean, is it actually more efficient to dry it first and then use the dry fuel versus just burning the wet fuel and ignoring the bad gases that come out?
I would expect that I haven't actually done a calculation or a test for that in practice, but I would expect that it would be worthwhile burning the small amount of wood that it takes to run the drying chimney, just because you can get such a big increase and such a big improvement in the dryness of the wood in a short period of time. So just running the cook stove on, say, about 250 grams of wood, which is not very much. That's that's basically this kind of handful of wood that we were looking at earlier. Using that much wood enables you to get dry firewood, to dry about 8 kilos of dry firewood. And I think you end up with, I'm not quite sure of the actual calculation, about 7 kilos after it's dried, because you're reducing the weight of the firewood just by drying it. You haven't got the weight of the water anymore in the firewood. But I guess probably the main reason for going to the trouble and using up the firewood in the drying process is that then when you come to use the firewood, whether it's on an open fire or a cook stove or a biochar cook stove, it's just a much nicer process. So you can end up with smoke, or exhaust, which have no visible vapors in them. There's no unburnt hydrocarbons. There's no steam in there. You can be cooking without any visible smoke whatsoever, and that means that you're not bothering neighbors. You're not having to breathe the stuff, and you're not having to worry about carbon monoxide and other nasty stuff while you're cooking.
James, sorry, this is Dan. I'm gonna have to cut off here. We're moving into the next session shortly. So maybe if folks wanted to follow up with you, what's a good way to do that?
Probably the easiest is Twitter, because I'm looking at that every day. So if you do a search on Twitter for climate rescue or for blind spotting, you'll find a funny looking guy with a cook stove in the picture. And so feel free, if you use Twitter, to ask me whatever you like. And thank you very much for taking part and being here and asking great questions.
Thank you, everyone.